So over the last 30 years, I've managed over 50,000 units. What I've learned is that it's not just about collecting rent and building wealth. Whether you're buying your first property or you've been doing this for years, there's a dark side to being a landlord that most people do not talk about. Here are 7 things that most people don't think about. The first one is evictions. Evictions are tough because you're displacing somebody from their home. There's a lot of noise around this, especially in the media. A landlord evicting a tenant, but there's always a reason. So the tenant either created a lot of damage or they're not paying. So it's essentially no different than somebody buying a car and not paying the payments, or buying a TV and not paying the payments and being repossessed. So the eviction process is just repossessing an apartment back because somebody didn't pay. And if they don't pay, then of course it affects the landlord, and the landlord can't pay their mortgage. Evictions are difficult, but they can be mitigated with a lot of really good property management techniques. One of the biggest issues for a landlord is when a tenant refuses to pay and they continue to occupy the premises, and the landlord is restricted from being able to take that back and try to get somebody in there that can pay. Each state has very different laws around this. They're called landlord-tenant laws, and there should be no surprise that some of the hardest states to be a landlord in are like California and New York. It can take months to evict somebody, and while there are other states that it can be in just a matter of a few weeks. What nobody ever talks about with evictions is that when you have somebody living in a property and they're not paying you, you still have all your expenses. You still have your mortgage, you still have your property taxes, your insurance, and all those things are due. So now you have all your expenses, but no income coming in because you have a tenant that's not paying you. But the media focuses on the tenant and not necessarily on the landlord. The second big one is property damage. It should be no surprise to you that tenants are going to treat your place like a rental. Like, we've heard this before. You guys have probably rented a car and you're like, oh, don't worry about it, it's a rental. A mistake a landlord can make is they can over improve a unit or a space for somebody, and then they go in there later and they're like, oh my God, I spent all this money in a unit and now it is not in great condition. The truth is there's a way to improve a unit so that it's just about right for rental, but not over improved. So the right thing to do is have it in a really good rentable condition, but don't overspend, because what does happen is property damage. So property damage can come from all kinds of things. It can come from fire, it can come from water, it can come from pets, it can come from kids. So all of those things do happen in a rental. And so as a landlord, you got to be prepared for those things. And sometimes they're really small, but sometimes they can be very, very big. At our company, we don't even discuss the kitchen fires anymore, overflow of the bathtubs or anything like that anymore, because they're so commonplace. But each one is about $5,000 or $10,000. You think about when you have 10,000 tenants and they're cooking at night on their stove, there's all kinds of things that can happen with kitchen fires, etc. It's very commonplace for us to have these open claims with insurance at all times surrounding flood and fire damage and things like that, things while you're managing a property. In many cases, the tenants can be really upset because their personal things get damaged through water damage or even through fire or smoke. And so now you have that issue as well. When you're managing lots of different tenants, you're going to have to expect that property damage is definitely part of the game. And being able to manage those issues with insurance and then the contractors after and the tenants themselves while they're dealing with the process is part of property ownership. Another big one is around capital expenses. I see this all the time. So when somebody buys something, they fail to really understand the useful life of all the components of a property. So let me give you an example. When you buy into an HOA or a homeowners association or a condo project, there's what they call a replacement reserve study. And the replacement reserve study goes through every single component on the whole property. It talks about the roofs, the roof tiles, the air conditioning, the parking lots, the landscaping, the plumbing, the electrical. All of those things are part of the replacement cost. So when was the last time the property got painted? All of that stuff is in there. So it's the same thing with the property that you buy. So let's say you buy a fourplex. There's going to be a time when the roof needs replaced. There's going to be a time when you have to repaint the property. There's going to be a time when you have to reseal, redo the parking lot. All of those things should be anticipated. Those are called capital expenses. These are very different than property damage, which I just explained, which typically happen at the resident level. What I've seen time and time again is inexperienced real estate investors, they buy an asset and they fail to understand the capital needs of the asset before they buy it. So in year 2 or year 3 or year 4, they have these big costs that take away from their cash flow. So before you buy a property, you better be clear on all the capital expenses that property is going to need. Those are going to be real costs that are going to take away from your cash flow that you should be distributing to yourself or your. The fourth one are lawyers. Now, everybody's favorite subject. You really need to understand landlord-tenant law. So wherever you're planning on buying, please understand what the tenant's rights are and what the landlord's rights are in those areas. And not every area is the same. You really need to understand the notice periods and the different things that it's going to take for you to be able to enforce the lease in each state. What happens a lot of times is the lawyers get involved. And when the lawyers get involved and there's lots of letter writing, then of course what you're going to start to see is your legal costs are going to go up. So traditionally, this is based on non-payment of rent. But be prepared for having a lawyer yourself and also potentially your tenants engaging a lawyer. And be prepared for 2 lawyers battling out over the landlord-tenant law. The irony is the system is broken. If you think about it, when does a lawyer stop getting paid? It's when they solve something. So the last thing they want to do is solve anything. So the letter writing just continues and the costs just keep going up, and the fight between the landlord and the tenant can escalate all the way to a court, to a judge, till judgment day, whatever that is. And that's, of course, when it ends. Just understand that legal expense is a big piece of owning a property, and that you need to be prepared for that and have that person on your team. There's numerous examples around lawyers representing tenants online. And some of those things, one of the wildest stories is where a tenant paid a landlord with a check. They moved in and the check bounced. And then the tenant engaged a lawyer to not pay for months after that. This was in the state of California. And then there was what's called a stay provision, which meant that tenant stayed in that unit and was in possession of that unit for almost a year. At the same time, the landlord lost the property and had to file bankruptcy because they had their mortgage and all their expenses and all those kinds of things. So that's an extreme example, but you could find these online all over the place. So when the tenants move out, you, of course, as a landlord, go walk that unit. And what you should be doing is doing photo evidence and filming, but also detailing all the different things that you're going to have to do to get that unit rent ready for the next person. By the way, this is not including marketing costs, and this is not including vacancy costs, which are an expense. This is just what is it going to take to get that unit rent ready for the next person. Now, this oftentimes is when the battle begins. If a tenant gives you, let's say, a couple $100, and the unit itself is just $200 to clean, let's say. If the tenant gives you $200 deposit, and your cleaners are $150 and your maintenance is a couple $100 and to paint the unit is a few $100, all of a sudden your cost to turnover might be $600, $700, $800, even $1,000, but you only have $200 from the tenant. Now you're in a dispute with the tenant. Now, again, you have to go back to the state and the landlord-tenant laws to see what's normal wear and tear and what isn't. Oftentimes, the tenants believe that their deposits should be returned and they left the units in really good condition. This is precisely why you need to have video and really good documentation of how the unit was occupied when they moved in a detailed move-in form. And then you also have to have a detailed move-out form. So it's clear what the unit looked like in the beginning, and it's clear what it looked like at the end. And then there's a cost to bring it back to the original condition. Oftentimes, the relationship between a tenant and the landlord can be adversarial because the tenant wants their money back and the landlord doesn't have enough money or is using their deposits to get that unit back to rent ready, just the way it was when they moved in. So this can often escalate to small claims court, and even higher. It can take a lot of extra time after somebody moves out. So this is another thing that a landlord could be dealing with even after the tenant moves, and you might even have somebody else in there. Somebody's disputing the charges and all the things it costs for them to get that unit back to rent ready. This could take months and months and even time and even lawyers well after the tenant moves out. Another one that people don't talk about are just tenant expectations. So I have tenants that have been in properties for 8 or 9 years and don't ever even contact me and do all their maintenance, that's a dream tenant. And then you have others that have never changed a light bulb and are doing things inside of their units and want you there all the time and want handyman to go show up. They're just normal things that happen while you're living in a place. So the expectation of the tenant needs to be set at the very, very beginning of what exactly the landlord is going to cover, because what happens is once there's an issue, let's say like the toilet won't flush, there oftentimes is a time frame of being able to get over there, give the tenant notice to be able to go inside of the unit, get a handyman to meet over there, and there's all these scheduling things that can happen in order to get inside of the unit to fix that particular toilet, for example. So you can imagine you've got the landlord, you've got the maintenance person, which could be you, and you've got the tenant all trying to figure out your schedules so you can go over there. There's proper notifications that you need to be able to give the tenant. In other words, you can't just show up and open the door and walk in. That all has to be scheduled with them. Oftentimes they're working. So there's all these things around scheduling for the ongoing things that the tenant wants. And sometimes it can be really, really extreme. For example, we've had tenants call and say that they need their light bulbs changed, or that a cabinet door is broken as a result of something that they did. These are all things that technically are their expenses, but they think that they're landlord expenses. So there needs to be an expectation about what a landlord does and should do and is required to do by law, and what the tenant is responsible for. And there's this gray area oftentimes depending on the tenant themselves. So there can be really, really high maintenance tenants and really low maintenance tenants. You don't often know until they move in who they're going to be, but the best thing you can do is articulate that all in writing in the rules and regulations and the lease before they move in, so that you're referring to that document each and every time. And the seventh is just time. So the question is, do you have time to manage your property, or do you want to have a third party do it? Because think of all the things that happen on a monthly basis. One, the tenant pays rent or they don't. And then you can have all the ensuing things that can happen as a result of that. Two, they have ongoing maintenance needs, which of course require scheduling and all of those things, the contractors and relationships and all of those things. Three, just the enforcement of the lease for all of the other things that can come up. Like maybe they decided they wanted to adopt a 50 or a 70 pound dog and just move them in one day. Now you have this kind of an issue, which of course you may or may not have a pet policy. And so all of those little things that require ongoing management that come up as a tenant continues to live in your property, whether it's property damage or lease breaks or non-payment of rent or maintenance issues or whatever they might be, it's time. So the question is, do you have the time to be able to manage this property effectively? And by the way, we're not even talking about when they move out and then you coordinate the unit to be rent ready, and then you of course have vacancy loss, and you of course have to advertise it, and then you have to show it. So you have to leave on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, let's say, and go show a unit to somebody that may or may not want to rent it. Resident screening and the application process and all of that stuff is just time. So depending on what you are doing right now, you got a question on whether or not you have the time. So a lot of people think property management is just collecting rent. How hard can that be? Especially if you just set it up with an ACH and it just hits your bank account. And it can be with the right systems, but generally there's a whole lot more to that. And my experience has been that you need to be able to budget at least 5 to 10 hours a week to be able to manage a unit effectively and the right way. So the advice I would have for someone who's thinking about becoming a landlord for the first time is just understand the time commitment. So the financial part is actually easy because it's just math based. In other words, do I buy this? Does it cash flow? What kind of return does it have? But the management is what produces the revenue. So it's one thing to look at it from a math standpoint, but then you have to hit all of those things. If you have time and you have no experience, your learning curve is going to be like this for the first several years. So I wrote a book about this years ago called The ABCs of Property Management. You can click on the link here and you're going to see that. Some of the stories I talked about, but a lot more that'll help you if you decide to manage property yourself, move forward correctly and more efficiently, and of course, ultimately more profitably. So real estate can build incredible wealth or it can crush you financially depending on what rules you follow. If you want to see the biggest mistakes real estate investors make, and of course how to avoid them, just watch this video next.